The garage door squeaked like a wounded animal as I wrestled with the bent hinge, my knuckles scraping against rusted metal. 43 years old, and here I was on a Saturday evening, fixing things that should have been replaced years ago while my wife primped for her precious dinner party. "Don't be weird tonight, okay?" Marta's voice echoed from the kitchen, sharp enough to cut glass. "Greg's coming. Try not to embarrass me." I paused, wrench in hand, and let that familiar burn settle in my chest. Greg Morrison, her boss at Sterling & Associates, the golden boy with his perfect teeth and expensive suits. The man who'd been occupying far too much of my wife's conversation lately. "Wouldn't dream of it," I called back, my voice steady as concrete. But inside, something was laughing. A dark, patient laugh that had been building for months. "My name is David Turner, and I used to believe in things like loyalty, marriage vows, and the basic decency of people you trust. I'm a project manager for the city's public works department, not glamorous, but honest work that keeps the lights on and the roads paved. Marta, on the other hand, climbed the advertising ladder with the determination of a woman who viewed life as a competition she intended to win. 20 years of marriage, 2 kids who barely call anymore, a mortgage on a house that felt more like a museum of better times. I should have seen it coming. The signs were there, scattered like breadcrumbs through our daily routine. Late nights at the office that stretched into early mornings, new clothes that never made it into our shared closet. The way she'd clutch her phone like a lifeline and disappear into the bathroom to answer texts. But the real wake-up call came 3 days ago. I'd been using her laptop to check my email when a notification popped up. Not snooping, just bad timing and worse luck. A message preview from Greg that made my stomach drop. "Can't wait for tonight. Room 237 at the Marriott. Wear that blue dress I like." 20 years of marriage, and my wife was planning hotel rendezvous with her boss while I fixed squeaky hinges and pretended everything was normal. The garage door finally cooperated, sliding smooth as silk. I stepped back, admiring my handiwork, and felt that dark laugh bubble up again. Tonight was Marta's 41st birthday, and she'd planned this elaborate dinner party to show off her success. Greg would be here, playing the role of supportive boss while I played the dutiful husband. But I had my own role to play tonight. "David!" Marta's voice cracked like a whip. "They're here!" I wiped my hands on an old rag and headed inside, past the kitchen where Marta stood in that blue dress, the one Greg apparently liked so much. She looked stunning, I had to admit. Blonde hair swept up in an elegant twist, makeup applied with surgical precision, diamond earrings catching the light. She used to dress up for me like that. "You're not wearing that shirt," she said, eyeing my work clothes with the same expression she'd use for roadside trash. "I'll change," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Wouldn't want to embarrass you." Something flickered across her face. Guilt, maybe, or just annoyance that I wasn't putting up more of a fight. She turned away, smoothing her dress, and I caught a whiff of expensive perfume. New perfume. The doorbell chimed, and Marta practically sprinted to answer it. I heard Greg's voice, smooth as aged whiskey, offering birthday wishes and compliments. Then came Lila Patterson, Marta's best friend since college, with her husband Rick. More voices followed, colleagues from the agency, neighbors, people who'd known us for years, but had no idea what was really happening behind our suburban facade. I changed into a clean shirt and rejoined the party, watching from the edges as Marta held court in our living room. She was in her element, laughing at Greg's jokes, touching his arm when she made a point, playing the perfect hostess while her husband faded into the background. "Great party," said Frank Kowalski, appearing at my elbow with a beer in hand. Frank ran the boxing gym where I'd been working out for the past few months, trying to burn off frustration with heavy bags and speed drills. He was the only person here who knew the real situation. "Just getting started," I said, accepting the beer he offered. Frank studied my face with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades reading fighters before a match. You sure about this? Never been more sure of anything in my life. Dinner was a production worthy of a magazine spread. Marta had ordered catering from some downtown restaurant, and every detail was perfect, from the cloth napkins to the artfully arranged flowers. I sat at one end of our dining table, Greg at the other, with Marta between us like a referee in a match nobody else knew was happening. "This salmon is incredible," gushed Janet Morrison, one of Marta's colleagues. "You have to give me the name of your caterer." "Sterling and Associates uses them for all our client events," Greg said, flashing that $1,000,000 smile. "I recommended them to Marta." Of course he did. I took a sip of wine and watched my wife beam at him like he'd just solved world hunger. "David's been working on some interesting projects lately," Lila said, probably trying to include me in the conversation. "Tell them about that bridge renovation." Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. All eyes turned to me, and I felt the familiar weight of their polite disinterest. These people lived in a world of creative campaigns and client presentations, where success was measured in awards and corner offices. My world of concrete and steel seemed quaint by comparison. "Just routine maintenance," I said, "keeping things from falling down." "So important," murmured someone, and the conversation quickly moved on to more exciting topics. But Greg wasn't done with me yet. "You know, David," he said, cutting his salmon with surgical precision, "I've been meaning to ask about your department's budget. We're pitching a campaign for the State Transportation Authority, and I'd love to get some insider perspective on infrastructure spending." The table went quiet. Greg's smile was friendly enough, but there was something else there. A challenge, maybe, or just the casual arrogance of someone who viewed other people as resources to be exploited. "That would be a conflict of interest," I said calmly. "I'm sure you understand." Of course, just making conversation." But his eyes said something different. His eyes said he was used to getting what he wanted, whether it was government contracts or other men's wives. I set down my fork and looked around the table at these people. My wife's people now, not mine. They were all watching, sensing tension but not understanding its source. "Actually," I said, "since we're talking about work, I've been curious about something myself." Marta shot me a warning look, but I ignored it. "Greg, you mentioned that Sterling and Associates handles a lot of municipal contracts. That must require some pretty sophisticated bidding strategies." "Well, yes, we have our methods." Greg's smile tightened slightly. "I bet you do." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a manila folder, placing it gently on the table. "See, the funny thing about working in city government is that you get to see all the public records. Bid submissions, contract awards, payment schedules." The folder sat there like a loaded weapon. "David," Marta said quietly, "what are you doing?" "Just sharing some interesting reading material." I opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers. "For instance, did you know that Sterling and Associates has won 14 municipal contracts in the past 2 years? That's a remarkable success rate." Greg's face had gone pale. "Those were all legitimate competitive bids." "Oh, I'm sure they were. But what's really fascinating is the timing." I pulled out another document. "See, most agencies submit their bids right at the deadline, but Sterling and Associates always seems to submit theirs just a day or two after the preliminary budget meetings, almost like they had inside information about what numbers to hit." The silence around the table was deafening. "That's quite an accusation," Greg said, his voice tight. "Is it? I'm just pointing out patterns, like how your winning bids consistently come in exactly 3% under the nearest competitor. Not 5%, not 1%. Always 3. That's either remarkable luck or remarkable intelligence." I could feel Marta's eyes boring into me, but I kept my focus on Greg. His perfect composure was cracking, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Of course, I continued, there could be innocent explanations. Maybe Sterling and Associates just has better market research. Maybe they're naturally gifted at reading the competitive landscape. David, that's enough, Marta snapped. Or maybe, I said, pulling out the final document, they have a source inside the city planning department. Someone who attends those preliminary budget meetings and has access to competitor information. Greg's wine glass shook in his hand. You can't prove anything. Can I? I smiled, and it felt like putting on a familiar mask. Tom Bradley, senior planner in the transportation division, graduated from State University in 1998, same class as your wife, Jennifer. They were roommates junior year according to the alumni directory. Small world, isn't it? The folder contained 3 months of careful research, cross-referenced documents, and circumstantial evidence that painted a clear picture of bid manipulation. Nothing illegal enough to warrant prosecution, but damaging enough to destroy a reputation. Greg stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I don't have to listen to this. No, you don't, I agreed. But I think the State Ethics Committee might be interested in these patterns. And the local business journal. They love stories about competitive irregularities in municipal contracting. You're bluffing. I pulled out my phone and showed him the screen, a draft email to the ethics hotline, complete with document attachments. My thumb hovered over the send button. Try me. Greg looked around the table at the shocked faces of Marta's colleagues, his professional network watching his careful facade crumble in real time. Then he grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. This isn't over, he said. Yes, it is, I replied, and pressed send. The email whooshed away into cyberspace, carrying with it Greg Morrison's reputation and career prospects. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft chime of my phone receiving a delivery confirmation. Marta's face was white with fury. How could you do this? Do what? Share publicly available information with the appropriate authorities? You've ruined everything. Have I? I looked around the table at her colleagues, her friends, her carefully constructed social network. Or have I just told the truth? Lila cleared her throat awkwardly. Maybe we should call it a night. The party dissolved quickly after that, guests making hasty excuses and awkward goodbyes. Within 20 minutes, our house was empty except for Marta and me, facing each other across the wreckage of her birthday dinner. You planned this, she said, her voice shaking with rage. I planned to have dinner with my wife and friends. Greg chose to make it about business. Don't lie to me, David. You've been planning this for weeks. I started clearing plates, stacking them with methodical precision. You're right. I have been planning something, but this was just the opening act. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at the screen and smiled. What now? Marta demanded. Greg's lawyer, threatening legal action. I showed her the message, then deleted it. Too bad he doesn't have a case. You're destroying our lives. No, I said, meeting her eyes for the first time all evening. I'm just returning the favor. The next morning brought consequences like rain after a drought, sudden, inevitable, and soaking everything in sight. My phone started buzzing at 6 a.m. with calls from reporters, colleagues, and curious neighbors who'd heard about the previous night's entertainment. I let them all go to voicemail. Marta had locked herself in the bedroom after our dinner party imploded, and I'd spent the night on the living room couch, listening to her make hushed phone calls through the thin walls. Damage control, probably, trying to salvage what remained of her professional relationships. Good luck with that. I made coffee and checked my email, finding exactly what I'd expected. 3 messages from local business reporters asking for comment on the ethics complaint, 2 from city council members wanting to discuss irregularities in the bidding process, and 1 from my boss asking if I needed to take some personal time. The last one made me laugh out loud. Personal time. As if what I was doing was personal. Well, maybe it was. The front door slammed, and I heard Marta's car screech out of the driveway. Off to Sterling and Associates for what promised to be an interesting Monday morning. I almost felt sorry for her, walking into that office knowing everyone had heard about Greg's public humiliation, knowing they'd all be wondering what else she might have known about his business practices. Almost. My own office was buzzing with curiosity when I arrived. Word travels fast in city government, especially when it involves potential corruption and ethics violations. I fielded a dozen questions with professional neutrality, emphasizing my duty to report suspicious patterns and my commitment to transparent governance. "You really think Morrison was getting inside information?" asked Janet Rodriguez, my assistant. "I think the Ethics Committee will investigate thoroughly and reach appropriate conclusions," I said, which was bureaucrat speak for absolutely, and I have the documentation to prove it. By lunchtime, the story had hit the local news websites. "City employee exposes potential bid rigging scheme," ran as the headline on Channel 7's site, complete with photos of Sterling and Associates' downtown office and a brief interview with the Ethics Committee chairman promising a full investigation. Greg Morrison's name appeared in the third paragraph, identified as the agency's director of municipal contracts and the subject of the complaint. By evening, his LinkedIn profile had been updated to remove all references to his current position. I drove to Frank's gym after work, needing to burn off the restless energy that had been building all day. The place smelled like sweat and determination, filled with the rhythmic sounds of gloves hitting heavy bags and feet dancing across canvas. "Saw the news," Frank said, taping my hands with practiced efficiency. "Nice work. Just getting started." "Yeah?" Frank raised an eyebrow. "What's next?" I threw a combination at the heavy bag, feeling the satisfying impact travel up my arms. "Greg's finished professionally. The ethics investigation will drag on for months, and even if they can't prove criminal wrongdoing, no municipal government will touch Sterling and Associates with a 10-foot pole. And your wife?" Another combination, harder this time. "She made her choice. Now she gets to live with the consequences." Frank nodded approvingly. "Just remember, revenge is like boxing. It's not about the hardest punch, it's about the smartest strategy." I spent an hour working the bags, pushing myself until my shirt was soaked with sweat and my knuckles ached despite the protective tape. Physical exertion helped clear my mind, let me think through the next phases of what I was starting to think of as my campaign. Because this was war now, even if only one side knew it. When I got home, Marta was waiting in the kitchen with a bottle of wine and what looked like a prepared speech. She'd changed out of her work clothes into jeans and a sweater, her "let's talk this through rationally" outfit. "We need to discuss what happened last night," she said. "Do we?" I grabbed a beer from the refrigerator and leaned against the counter. "Seems pretty straightforward to me." "David, please. I know you're upset, but destroying Greg's career isn't going to solve our problems." "Our problems?" I took a long drink and studied her face. "What problems are those, exactly?" She looked away, and I saw the first crack in her composure. "You know what I mean." "Actually, I don't. Why don't you spell it out for me?" "We've been growing apart. I know that. We both know that. But what you did last night..." "What I did last night was expose a corrupt business practice. I thought you'd be proud of me for standing up for ethical standards." "Don't play games with me." "Games?" I set down my beer and moved closer. "You want to talk about games? Let's talk about room 237 at the Marriott. Let's talk about new perfume and late nights at the office. Let's talk about that blue dress you're wearing in the photos Greg has been showing around the agency." The color drained from her face. "How did you know about the photos? Greg's not as discreet as he thinks he is. Turns out, when you humiliate someone publicly, their enemies start sharing information." It was a bluff, but a good one. Marta's reaction told me everything I needed to know. David, I can explain. Can you? Because I'd love to hear the explanation for how my wife of 20 years ended up playing dress-up for her boss while I fixed garage doors and pretended not to notice. She started crying then, which might have moved me 6 months ago. Now it just felt like another manipulation, another performance in a marriage that had become nothing but theater. It wasn't supposed to happen, she said. It just developed. Developed. Like a photograph or a disease. That's not fair. Fair? I laughed, and it came out harsher than I intended. You want to talk about fair? Fair would have been having this conversation before you started planning hotel meetings with Greg. Fair would have been telling me you wanted out of this marriage instead of sneaking around behind my back. I never meant to hurt you. But you did, and now you get to find out what that feels like. I left her crying in the kitchen and went upstairs to the spare bedroom, where I'd been sleeping for the past 3 months without either of us acknowledging the change. The room was small and cramped, filled with boxes of old files and seasonal decorations, but it was mine in a way the master bedroom hadn't been for years. My laptop was waiting on the desk, along with a fresh stack of documents I'd printed at work. Greg Morrison's professional destruction was just the beginning. Now it was time to focus on the real target. I opened a new browser window and started typing. The private investigator's website was professional but discreet, promising confidential research services for sensitive situations. I'd found it through a referral from one of the divorce attorneys whose ads ran during daytime television. Not exactly the yellow pages, but close enough. 24 hours later, I was sitting in a coffee shop downtown, across from a middle-aged woman named Patricia Chen, who looked more like a librarian than a private investigator. She wore sensible shoes and carried a briefcase that had seen better decades. You understand that I can't help you obtain information through illegal means, she said, reviewing the retainer agreement. I understand. I'm looking for documentation of activities that are already happening in public spaces. Hotel registrations, restaurant receipts, travel records, things that would be discoverable in divorce proceedings. Divorce proceedings? She looked up from the paperwork. Are you planning to file? I'm planning to be prepared. Patricia nodded and made a note in her file. How long do you suspect this has been going on? 6 months, maybe longer. They've been careful, but not careful enough. They usually aren't. People in the middle of affairs tend to think they're more clever than they actually are. She quoted me a daily rate that made my eyes water, but I signed the agreement anyway. Some things were worth the investment. How long do you think you'll need? I asked. For a case like this? 2 weeks should be sufficient. Most people are creatures of habit even when they're trying to be secretive. Especially then, I thought. I spent the rest of the week maintaining normal routines while Patricia worked her magic. I went to the office, attended meetings, filed reports, and pretended to care about storm drain maintenance and road resurfacing schedules. At home, Marta and I moved around each other like polite strangers, making small talk about groceries and utility bills while carefully avoiding any mention of Greg Morrison or ethics investigations. The news cycle had moved on to other scandals, but the damage was done. Sterling and Associates had lost 3 municipal contracts and was facing a formal review by the state attorney general's office. Greg's name appeared on a list of individuals under investigation, which effectively ended his career in government relations. You must be satisfied, Marta said one evening, finding me reading in the living room. About what? Greg's been fired. The agency is restructuring their entire municipal division. I looked up from my book, a biography of Ulysses Grant, who knew something about winning wars through superior logistics. That's unfortunate. I hope he finds something more suitable to his talents. You destroyed his life. I exposed his business practices. There's a difference. She stood there for a moment, probably trying to decide whether to push the argument further. Then she shook her head and walked away, leaving me to read about Sherman's march to the sea and the importance of total victory. Patricia called on Friday with her preliminary report. "Your instincts were correct," she said. "I have documentation going back 8 months, hotels, restaurants, a weekend trip to Chicago last month when you thought she was at a conference." "What kind of documentation?" "Credit card receipts, hotel registration records, photographs of them entering and leaving various locations. Nothing inappropriate in the photos. They were careful about public displays of affection, but the pattern is clear." "How clear?" "Clear enough for any divorce attorney in the state. Your wife and Mr. Morrison have been conducting a systematic affair, using company resources to fund their activities. There are also some interesting financial irregularities, expense reports that don't match actual expenditures, corporate credit card charges for personal items." I felt that familiar dark satisfaction settling in my chest. "Send me everything." "Mr. Turner, I should mention that Mr. Morrison has been trying to contact your wife repeatedly since the ethics complaint became public. He seems desperate." "Desperate how?" "Angry phone calls, showing up at her office, following her car. I have photographs of him waiting in the parking garage at her building. If I were you, I'd be concerned about escalation." Escalation. That was exactly what I was counting on. "Keep monitoring the situation," I said. "And Patricia? Start looking into Morrison's financial situation. I want to know about debts, assets, anything that might explain why he's so desperate to maintain his relationship with my wife. You think there's more to this than just an affair? There's always more. People like Greg Morrison don't risk their careers for romance. They risk them for money." That weekend, I implemented the next phase of my campaign. While Marta was at her book club, or wherever she actually went on Saturday afternoons, I visited our bank and restructured our accounts. As the primary account holder on our joint checking and savings, I had the legal right to limit access and require dual signatures for major transactions. I also canceled the credit cards that were linked to my accounts and requested new ones with different numbers. The bank manager, a woman named Helen who'd handled our mortgage for 15 years, looked uncomfortable with the changes. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Turner? These kinds of financial restrictions can complicate household management." "I'm sure. My wife has her own accounts for personal expenses. These changes only affect our shared finances." Which was technically true. Marta did have her own checking account, with a balance of roughly $300 and a credit limit that wouldn't cover a decent dinner. The real money, my salary, our savings, the investment accounts, flowed through the joint accounts I'd just locked down. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in months. The afternoon sun was warm on my face, and I found myself humming an old song I hadn't thought about in years. Something about satisfaction and getting what you need. Marta's car was in the driveway when I arrived, which meant book club had ended early, or maybe she'd never gone to book club at all. These days, I assumed everything she told me was a lie until proven otherwise. She was waiting in the kitchen with her laptop open and her phone in her hand, both displaying error messages from various financial websites. "What did you do?" she asked. "Restructured our accounts. I decided we needed better oversight of our household expenses." "You locked me out of our own bank accounts." "I added security measures. You can still access everything. You just need my signature for transactions over $500. "That's insane. How am I supposed to pay bills? How am I supposed to buy groceries?" I pulled out my wallet and counted out $200 in 20s, laying them on the kitchen counter like poker chips. "Household expenses. Should cover groceries for the week." She stared at the money like I'd offered her pocket change. "David, this is financial abuse. This is financial responsibility. We're married, remember? Community property. I'm just making sure our community assets are properly managed." "You can't do this." "Actually, I can. I spoke with the bank manager this afternoon. As the primary account holder and sole contributor to our savings, I have the legal right to implement security measures." Which was mostly true. though I suspected those rights wouldn't survive a divorce proceeding. But we weren't divorced yet. "I'm calling a lawyer," she said. "Good idea. While you're at it, you might want to call Greg. I understand he's been trying to reach you." Her face went white. "How did you know about his phone calls? His visits to your office? His little tantrum in the parking garage yesterday?" I smiled. "Marta, you're not the only one with sources of information." I left her standing in the kitchen, clutching her phone and staring at the cash I'd left on the counter. Upstairs in my temporary bedroom, I opened my laptop and reviewed Patricia's latest report, complete with timestamps and photographs. Greg Morrison was unraveling faster than I'd anticipated. Good. Desperate people made mistakes, and mistakes created opportunities. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. This has gone far enough." I deleted the message without responding. Greg Morrison and I had nothing to discuss, but we would soon enough. Greg Morrison's desperation became the talk of Sterling and Associates within days. According to Patricia's surveillance reports, he'd been showing up at Marta's office building every morning, waiting in the parking garage like some lovesick teenager. The security guards had started recognizing him, and not in a good way. "He's becoming a liability," Patricia told me during our weekly coffee meeting. "Yesterday he followed her to lunch and caused a scene at the restaurant. Management had to ask him to leave." "What kind of scene?" "Loud conversation, gesturing, other diners staring. Your wife looked mortified." Patricia slid a manila envelope across the table. "I have photographs." The pictures told the story better than words. Greg, unshaven and wild-eyed, leaning across a restaurant table while Marta pressed herself back in her chair. Other diners turning to stare. A waiter hovering nearby, clearly debating whether to intervene. "He's lost weight," I observed. "Stress will do that. So will unemployment and pending legal troubles." "Legal troubles?" Patricia smiled grimly. "The ethics investigation expanded yesterday. They're now looking into his personal finances, specifically some consulting fees he received from companies that later won municipal contracts. The state attorney general is calling it a pattern of corruption." I felt that familiar warmth spreading through my chest. "How long before charges are filed?" "Could be months, could be weeks. Depends on what they find in his bank records." Which reminded me of my own financial maneuvers. Marta had been operating on a cash allowance for 2 weeks now, and the strain was showing. She'd started bringing lunch from home instead of eating at the trendy downtown restaurant she preferred. Her manicure appointments had stopped. She'd even mentioned looking at used cars since her lease was up for renewal and she couldn't access our joint accounts to make the payment. "There's something else," Patricia said, pulling out another photograph. "Your wife met with a divorce attorney yesterday. Margaret Hoffman, downtown. She's expensive." The photograph showed Marta walking into a glass office tower, her face grim with determination. She was wearing her best suit, armor for battle. "How expensive?" "Retainer starts at $20,000. She specializes in high-asset divorces." I laughed, which earned me a curious look from the barista. "High asset. That's optimistic." "You're not worried?" "Should I be?" Patricia studied my face with professional interest. "Most people would be concerned about divorce proceedings. Most people haven't spent 3 months documenting their spouse's adultery and financial misconduct." I tapped the envelope of photographs. "Margaret Hoffman is expensive because she wins cases, but she can't win cases where the client has no money to pay her fees and no assets to claim." "Your wife doesn't know about the financial restrictions?" "She knows about the account changes. She doesn't know about the other measures." Which was true. Marta had no idea that I'd been systematically documenting every aspect of our marriage, from financial records to property ownership to her professional misconduct. She also didn't know that I'd been consulting with my own attorney, a quiet, methodical man named Robert Walsh, who specialized in protecting assets during contentious divorces. "The key to defensive divorce strategy," Walsh had explained, "is preparation. By the time your spouse files papers, you want every aspect of your financial life documented and protected. I'd been preparing for months. My phone buzzed with another text from Greg's number. "Answer your phone. We can work this out." I showed the message to Patricia, who frowned. "He's getting more aggressive. Yesterday he tried to follow your wife home from work. She had to drive to a police station to lose him." "Interesting. Did she file a report?" "No. Just sat in the parking lot until he gave up and left." Of course she hadn't filed a report. That would have meant explaining why her unemployed former boss was stalking her, which would have led to uncomfortable questions about their relationship. "Keep monitoring him," I said. "And Patricia? I want to know about his financial situation, bank accounts, credit cards, debts, everything." "That's more invasive than standard surveillance. Bill me accordingly." That evening, I found Marta pacing the living room with her phone pressed to her ear, having what sounded like a tense conversation with someone who wasn't giving her the answers she wanted. "I understand the retainer requirement," she was saying, "but there has to be some flexibility in the payment terms." Divorce attorney. Had to be. She ended the call and threw her phone onto the couch with enough force to crack the screen. "Problems?" I asked. "Don't pretend you don't know what's happening. I know you've been meeting with lawyers. I know Greg Morrison has been harassing you at work. I know you're frustrated with our current financial arrangements." I settled into my reading chair and opened my book. "Beyond that, I'm just speculating." "This is ridiculous, David. We're both adults. We can work this out without destroying each other." "Can we? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been working on destroying our marriage for the better part of a year." She sat down across from me, and for a moment I saw a flash of the woman I'd married 20 years ago. Vulnerable, uncertain, looking for reassurance that everything would work out. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," she said quietly. "How was it supposed to happen?" "I don't know. I felt invisible, David. Like I was disappearing into this life we'd built, becoming someone I didn't recognize." "So, you decided to become someone else's wife instead?" "It wasn't like that." "What was it like?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. "Greg made me feel important, like I mattered, like I was worth paying attention to. And I didn't. When was the last time you really looked at me? When was the last time we had a conversation that wasn't about bills or schedules or household maintenance?" It was a fair question, and I didn't have a good answer. Somewhere along the way, we'd stopped being husband and wife and become business partners managing the enterprise of our shared life. "You're right," I said. "We both let this marriage become something neither of us wanted." Hope flickered across her face. "So we can fix it?" "No, we can end it honestly." The hope died as quickly as it had appeared. "What do you mean?" "I mean we can acknowledge that our marriage is over and figure out how to dissolve it fairly. Or you can keep lying to me, and I can keep making your life complicated until one of us gives up. You're threatening me. I'm offering you a choice: clean divorce with reasonable terms, or a messy battle where we both lose everything to lawyers." She stood up abruptly. "I need time to think." "Take all the time you need. But Marta, while you're thinking, you might want to have a conversation with Greg about his expectations. Because from what I hear, he's getting desperate, and desperate people make poor decisions." She left the room without answering, but I could see the wheels turning. Greg's increasingly erratic behavior was becoming a problem for her too, threatening her professional reputation and personal safety. That night, I lay in bed listening to her make phone calls through the thin walls. Hushed conversations that stretched past midnight, punctuated by long silences and what sounded like crying. Good. Let her wrestle with the consequences of her choices. The next morning brought news that changed everything. I was reading email at my office when Patricia called with an update that made me sit up straight. "Greg Morrison was arrested last night," she said without preamble. "Arrested for what?" "Harassment, stalking, in violation of a restraining order that was apparently filed yesterday afternoon. I felt the pieces clicking into place. Marta filed the restraining order? Looks like it. According to the police report, Morrison showed up at her apartment building around 10 p.m. and tried to force his way into the lobby. Security cameras caught the whole thing. Apartment building? What apartment building? Patricia was quiet for a moment. You didn't know? Your wife has been renting a studio apartment downtown for the past month. She's been staying there most nights. The information hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been playing chess, Marta had been moving her pieces off the board entirely. Send me the address, I said. Mr. Turner, I should advise against. Send me the address. An hour later, I was standing outside a converted warehouse in the Arts District, looking up at a building that represented everything I didn't know about my wife's current life. The studio apartments were expensive, trendy, designed for young professionals and empty nesters who wanted to live downtown. The kind of place Marta had always talked about wanting to try. I didn't go inside. Instead, I sat in my car and called Robert Walsh. We need to accelerate our timeline, I told him. What's changed? My wife has been maintaining a separate residence without my knowledge. She's also involved in a harassment case with her former lover, who was arrested last night for stalking. Walsh whistled softly. That complicates things. How long has she been living separately? At least a month, maybe longer. That could establish grounds for legal separation, which affects property division and support obligations. In whose favor? Depends on the circumstances. If she moved out due to the affair being exposed, that works in your favor. If she moved out due to your financial restrictions, that could be seen as constructive abandonment on your part. Legal chess. Every move had consequences, and I was starting to realize I might not be as far ahead as I'd thought. What do you recommend? File first. Today, if possible. We can always modify the terms later, but initial filing establishes the timeline and gives us control over the narrative. I spent the rest of the day in Walsh's office, reviewing documents and signing papers that would officially end my 20-year marriage. The petition was straightforward. Irreconcilable differences, equitable distribution of assets, no request for spousal support. Clean and simple. Marta would be served with papers within 48 hours, probably at her downtown apartment, by a process server who would find her address more easily than I had. One more thing, Walsh said as I prepared to leave. You mentioned that Morrison was arrested. If your wife was involved with him financially, as well as romantically, that could affect the property division. How so? If marital assets were used to support the affair, hotels, restaurants, gifts, that's considered dissipation of marital property. We can claim reimbursement. Patricia's financial investigation was looking more valuable by the day. I drove home through evening traffic, past the downtown district where Marta was probably sitting in her studio apartment, dealing with the aftermath of Greg's arrest and contemplating her rapidly shrinking options. The house felt different when I walked inside, emptier but also more peaceful, like a weight had been lifted that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. My phone rang as I was heating up leftover pizza. Marta's number. We need to talk, she said. Do we? David, please. This has gotten out of hand. Has it? From where I'm sitting, things are finally getting organized. Greg is in jail. He's not handling any of this well. That's unfortunate, but it's not really my problem. It could become your problem. He's been saying things about you, about the ethics complaint. He thinks you're trying to frame him for something bigger. I felt a chill of genuine concern. Desperate people were unpredictable, and Greg Morrison had already demonstrated poor judgment. What kind of things? Paranoid things. He thinks you have some kind of conspiracy against him, that you're working with his enemies at the agency. Are his enemies numerous enough to form a conspiracy? This isn't funny, David. He's talking about revenge, about making you pay for destroying his life. Let me worry about Greg Morrison. You focus on your own situation. What situation? The divorce papers you'll be receiving tomorrow. I thought you should have advance warning. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. You filed for divorce? This afternoon. Clean terms, equitable distribution, no spousal support. We can work out the details through our attorneys. David, wait. We can still… No, we can't. It's over, Marta. It's been over for months. I'm just making it official. I hung up and turned off my phone, settling into my chair with my book and my leftover pizza. Outside, the sun was setting behind the trees in our backyard. My backyard now, at least, until the property settlement was finalized. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely relaxed. That feeling lasted exactly 12 hours. I woke up to the sound of breaking glass and my car alarm screaming in the driveway. Through the bedroom window, I could see my Honda Civic with its windshield spider-webbed and its driver's side mirror hanging by electrical wires. Greg Morrison stood in my front yard holding a baseball bat, his face twisted with rage and what looked like a complete break from reality. "You want to destroy my life?" he screamed at the house. "Let's see how you like it." I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 while staying clear of the windows. Greg was swinging the bat at anything within reach: my mailbox, the decorative lamp post, the ceramic planters Marta had arranged by the front door. 911, what's your emergency? Someone is vandalizing my property with a baseball bat, 1247 Oak Street. Are you in immediate danger? I watched Greg take another swing at my car, this time shattering the rear window. Possibly. The suspect appears to be having some kind of breakdown. Police are on their way. Stay inside and away from windows. Good advice. But I found myself moving toward the front door anyway. Greg Morrison had been a theoretical problem until now, an obstacle to be managed, a variable in my revenge equation. Seeing him in my yard, destroying my property, made it personal in a way I hadn't expected. "Morrison!" I called through the door. "Police are coming! You need to leave now!" He spun toward the sound of my voice, and I got my first clear look at him since the birthday party. He'd lost at least 20 pounds, his expensive suit replaced by wrinkled khakis and a stained shirt. His hair was uncombed, his face unshaven, his eyes wild with the kind of desperation that made people dangerous. "You think you're so smart," he yelled. "You think you can ruin my life and just walk away?" "I think you're ruining your own life. This isn't helping your situation." "My situation?" He laughed high and sharp. "My situation is that I lost my job, my reputation, and my girlfriend because you decided to play detective. You lost those things because you made poor choices. I just documented them." That was apparently the wrong thing to say. Greg raised the bat and charged the front door, swinging with enough force to crack the wooden frame. I stepped back quickly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sirens were getting closer. "Greg, stop! You're only making this worse!" But he was past listening. He swung again, this time at the front window, sending glass cascading onto the living room carpet. Then he moved to the side of the house, where my air conditioning unit became his next target. By the time the police arrived, Greg had caused several $1,000s in damage and worked himself into a state that required 3 officers to subdue him. I watched from my broken front window as they wrestled him to the ground, his voice hoarse from screaming threats and accusations. "He's been stalking my wife," I told the responding officer, a tired-looking sergeant named Martinez. "There's already a restraining order on file." "Your wife?" "Soon-to-be ex-wife. She filed the restraining order yesterday after he was arrested for harassment." Martinez made notes while his colleagues loaded Greg into the back of a patrol car. "We'll need a full statement and documentation of the property damage for the report." It took 2 hours to process everything: photographs of the damage, written statements, contact information for insurance claims. By the time the police left, my quiet suburban street had returned to normal, except for the glass in my driveway and the whispers from neighbors who'd watched the drama unfold from their windows. I was sweeping up glass when Marta arrived. She parked at the curb and approached cautiously, taking in the damage with wide eyes. "Oh my God, David, are you okay?" "Fine, just some property damage. I heard about it on the police scanner app. I came as soon as I could." Which raised the question of why she was monitoring police scanners, but I let it pass. "He's completely lost it," she said, staring at my shattered car windows. "When I saw him yesterday, he was talking about making you pay, but I never thought he'd actually what? Follow through on his threats? Morrison's been escalating for weeks. This was inevitable." "You don't understand. He blames you for everything. The ethics investigation, losing his job, our relationship ending. He's convinced himself that you orchestrated some kind of elaborate conspiracy." I leaned on my broom and studied her face. "Did you tell him about the divorce papers?" I had to. He kept calling, kept showing up. I thought if he knew it was really over between us, he'd leave me alone. And instead, he decided to take it out on me. "David, I'm sorry. I never wanted any of this to happen. But it did happen, and now we all have to deal with the consequences." She helped me finish cleaning up the glass, working in the kind of comfortable silence we hadn't shared in months. For a moment, it almost felt like the old days, two people facing a problem together instead of two adversaries maneuvering for advantage. Almost. "The insurance adjuster will be here this afternoon," I said, dumping the last of the glass into a trash bag. "I'll need to get statements from the neighbors about what they witnessed." "What about Greg?" "What about him? He'll be charged with vandalism, violation of a restraining order, and probably a few other things. His legal problems just got a lot more expensive. He doesn't have money for lawyers. He's been borrowing from friends just to pay rent." I felt that familiar dark satisfaction. Then he should have thought about that before he decided to destroy my property. Marta looked at me with something that might have been disappointment. "You're enjoying this." "Enjoying what? Having my car vandalized? Having my front door damaged? Having a deranged ex-lover of my wife terrorize my neighborhood?" "You're enjoying watching him fall apart." She wasn't wrong. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing Greg Morrison reduced from smooth-talking executive to desperate criminal, swinging a baseball bat at problems he'd created for himself. "He made his choices," I said. "I'm just watching the results." "You made choices too. You could have handled this differently." "How? By pretending I didn't know about your affair? By letting you and Greg continue your little romance while I played the fool? By talking to me instead of launching some elaborate revenge campaign? I tried talking to you. You lied to my face for months." She didn't have an answer for that. My phone rang. Patricia Chen, probably calling about the morning's excitement. "I heard about the incident," she said without preamble. "Are you all right?" "Fine. Morrison's in custody, and I have plenty of documentation for the insurance claim. There's something else you need to know. I've been monitoring his communications, and he's been in contact with someone at your office." That got my attention. "Someone at my office?" "Phone records show multiple calls to the city planning department over the past week. I'm still working on identifying the specific person." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. If Greg was trying to retaliate by causing problems at my job, this situation was about to get much more complicated. "Keep digging," I said. "And Patricia? I want to know everything about his financial situation. Bank accounts, debts, who he's been borrowing money from. Already on it. I should have a full report by tomorrow." After Marta left, I spent the afternoon dealing with insurance adjusters and repair estimates. The damage was extensive but not catastrophic. New windows for the car and house, repairs to the front door and air conditioning unit, replacement of various landscaping elements that had fallen victim to Greg's bat. The financial cost would be covered by insurance. The psychological impact was harder to calculate. For months, I'd been playing a careful game of chess, maneuvering pieces and planning strategies while maintaining the illusion of normal life. Greg's attack had shattered that illusion, literally and figuratively. Now everyone in the neighborhood knew that David Turner was involved in some kind of domestic drama that included restraining orders and property destruction. My quiet suburban anonymity was gone. But maybe that wasn't entirely bad. There was something liberating about having the conflict out in the open, about not having to pretend anymore that everything was fine. That evening, I drove my glass-covered car to Frank's gym, where the familiar rhythm of training helped clear my head. "Heard you had some excitement today," Frank said, wrapping my hands for sparring practice. "News travels fast. In a town this size? Your neighbor's cousin works dispatch. She said Morrison went completely berserk." I threw a few practice jabs, testing my range and timing. "He's been building up to something like this for weeks. What's your next move?" "Legally, let the system handle him. He's facing multiple charges now, and he doesn't have resources for a good defense." "And personally?" I paused, considering the question. For months, my focus had been on exposing Marta's affair and destroying Greg's career. Both goals had been accomplished, but the victory felt incomplete. "I want to understand why he's so desperate," I said finally. "People don't usually risk everything for a relationship that's already over." Maybe it wasn't just about the relationship. "What do you mean?" Frank adjusted my hand wraps, his expression thoughtful. "You said he was involved in some kind of bid-rigging scheme. What if your wife knew more about that than she's admitting?" It was an interesting theory. Marta worked in account management at Sterling and Associates, which meant she had access to client information, budget data, and strategic planning documents. If Greg had been using inside information to manipulate municipal contracts, he might have needed someone on the inside to help him. Someone like a trusted colleague who was also his lover. "That would explain why he's so desperate to maintain contact with her," I said, "and why he's so angry at you for breaking them up." I spent an hour working the heavy bag, thinking through the implications. If Marta had been involved in Greg's corruption scheme, that changed everything about our divorce proceedings. It also explained why she'd been so eager to settle quickly and quietly. After training, I sat in my car outside the gym and called Robert Walsh. "I need you to expand the financial investigation," I told him. "I want to know if my wife had any involvement in her lover's business practices." "That's a serious accusation. Do you have evidence?" "I have suspicions and a private investigator who's very good at finding evidence." "David, I have to advise caution here. If you're wrong about this, it could backfire badly in the divorce proceedings." "And if I'm right?" "If you're right, your wife could be facing criminal charges alongside Morrison." I thought about Marta helping me clean up glass that morning, the comfortable silence we'd shared, the flash of vulnerability in her eyes. Then I thought about 20 years of marriage destroyed by lies and betrayal. "Keep digging," I said. The next morning brought Patricia's financial report and a revelation that changed everything I thought I knew about my wife's affair. Patricia's report landed on my desk like a small bomb disguised as manila envelope. I'd expected to find evidence of Greg's financial desperation, maybe some details about his mounting legal bills and dwindling bank account. What I found instead was a carefully documented trail of financial fraud that stretched back 18 months and involved my wife far more deeply than I'd imagined. "Sterling and Associates has been systematically overbilling municipal contracts," Patricia explained during our emergency meeting. "The scheme worked like this. Greg would use inside information to submit winning bids, then inflate the actual project costs through a network of shell companies." Shell companies? Fake businesses that existed only on paper. They'd submit invoices for work that was never performed or charge premium rates for standard services. The money would flow through these companies and eventually end up in personal accounts. She spread out bank statements and corporate filings across the coffee shop table like a dealer arranging cards. "Here's where it gets interesting," she continued. 3 of the shell companies were registered to an address that belongs to your wife's downtown apartment. I stared at the documents, feeling pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Marta was involved in the fraud? More than involved. According to these records, she was a signatory on several of the shell company accounts. She also received regular payments that were disguised as consulting fees. The numbers were staggering. Over 18 months, the scheme had diverted nearly $500,000 from municipal contracts into personal accounts. Marta's share appeared to be around $60,000, money that had been used to fund her downtown apartment, her new wardrobe, and probably the expensive divorce attorney she couldn't afford. This explains why Morrison is so desperate, Patricia said. If the authorities discover this financial trail, both he and your wife are looking at federal fraud charges. Federal? Municipal contracts involve federal funding. That makes it a federal crime. I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and nausea. For months, I'd been focused on exposing a simple affair, not realizing that I'd stumbled onto a much larger criminal conspiracy. What's the statute of limitations on something like this? For federal fraud? 5 years. They have plenty of time to build a case. I gathered up the documents, my mind already working through the implications. This information was valuable enough to end the divorce proceedings in my favor, but it was also dangerous enough to destroy Marta's life completely. The question was, how far was I willing to go? That afternoon, I sat in Robert Walsh's office while he reviewed Patricia's report with the careful attention of someone who'd seen similar cases before. "This is explosive," he said finally. "If even half of this is accurate, your wife is looking at serious federal charges. What are my options? Legally? You could turn this information over to the authorities and let them handle it. The divorce would become a secondary concern if your wife is facing criminal prosecution. And personally?" Walsh leaned back in his chair, studying my face. "That depends on what you want to accomplish. Revenge? Justice? A clean end to your marriage? I want her to understand what betrayal feels like. She's about to learn that lesson whether you're involved or not. Morrison's arrest has attracted federal attention. The FBI is already looking into the ethics complaints, and it's only a matter of time before they discover the financial irregularities." Which meant I had a limited window to decide how to use this information. That evening, I drove to Marta's downtown apartment building and called her from the lobby. "We need to talk," I said. "David? How did you find my address?" "Does it matter? We need to talk, and it needs to happen now." She buzzed me up to the 8th floor, where I found her waiting in the hallway outside her apartment. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by stress and the weight of secrets that were becoming harder to carry. The apartment was exactly what I'd expected. Modern, minimalist, expensive. The kind of place she'd always dreamed of living, funded by money stolen from the city we'd both called home for 20 years. "Nice place," I said, settling onto her designer couch. "Must be expensive." "David, what do you want?" I pulled out a copy of Patricia's report and set it on her glass coffee table. "I want to understand how my wife became a federal criminal." The color drained from her face as she recognized the bank statements and corporate filings. "Where did you get this?" "Does it matter? The question is, what are we going to do about it?" She sat down across from me, her hands shaking as she flipped through the documents. "You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "How was it supposed to happen?" "Greg said it was just creative accounting. Municipal contracts always have cost overruns, and we were just managing the process more efficiently." "By stealing $500,000? By ensuring that projects were completed on time and under budget?" "Marta, these are fake companies. They didn't complete any projects. They just submitted invoices for work that never happened." She was crying now, but I felt no urge to comfort her. This was the woman who'd shared my bed for 20 years while planning to steal from our community. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said. "At first, it was just small amounts. Money to help with the apartment lease, to buy clothes for client meetings. Greg said everyone did it. Everyone doesn't do it. That's why it's called fraud. What are you going to do with this information? It was the question I'd been wrestling with all day. I had enough evidence to destroy her completely, to ensure that she spent the next decade in federal prison. I also had enough evidence to negotiate a divorce settlement that would leave me with everything we'd built together. The problem was that revenge, no matter how justified, came with its own costs. That depends, I said. On what? On whether you're willing to tell me the truth about everything. All of it. No more lies, no more manipulation, no more games. She wiped her eyes and looked at me with something that might have been hope. What do you want to know? I want to know when the affair started. I want to know when the fraud started. I want to know how you justified betraying everything we built together. The affair started 8 months ago. Greg was working late on the municipal contracts, and I was helping him prepare presentations. One night we just connected. It wasn't planned, David. It just happened. And the fraud? That started before the affair. Greg had been skimming small amounts from contracts for over a year. When we got involved personally, he brought me into it. Because he needed someone with access to account management systems. She nodded miserably. I helped him create the shell companies and manage the invoicing. It was supposed to be temporary, just until he could establish his own consulting business. With stolen money? With money that would have been wasted on bureaucratic inefficiency anyway. I almost laughed at the rationalization. Marta, you stole from road repair budgets, from school construction projects, from infrastructure that real people depend on. I know it was wrong, but by the time I realized how bad it had gotten, I was in too deep to stop. So you decided to divorce me and disappear with your share of the money. I decided to try to salvage something from this mess before it destroyed both our lives. I stood up and walked to her windows, looking out at the city lights spread below us. Somewhere out there, roads were crumbling because money meant for repairs had been diverted into shell companies. Schools were operating with outdated equipment because construction funds had been stolen by people who thought they were smarter than the system. Here's what's going to happen, I said, without turning around. You're going to sign a divorce agreement that gives me full custody of our assets and waives any claim to spousal support. In exchange, I'll give you a head start before I turn this information over to the authorities. How much of a head start? 72 hours. Enough time to get your affairs in order and maybe hire a good criminal defense attorney. David, please. There has to be another way. I turned back to face her, and for a moment I saw the woman I'd married. Young, ambitious, full of dreams about the life we'd build together. Then I remembered the hotel receipts, the secret apartment, the months of lies told with a straight face over breakfast. There is another way, I said. You can refuse to sign the divorce agreement and take your chances with a federal investigation that's already underway. Morrison's arrest has attracted attention from people who are very good at following money trails. The FBI? Among others. Turns out, when you file ethics complaints about municipal contracts, it triggers automatic reviews of financial records. They're probably already looking at Sterling and Associates' books. She sank onto her couch like a deflated balloon. How long do I have to decide? The divorce papers are ready to file. I can submit them tomorrow morning, or I can wait until after you've had a chance to consider your options. And if I sign? Then you get a clean divorce and a 3-day head start before I fulfill my civic duty to report suspected fraud. That's not much of a choice. It's more of a choice than you gave me when you decided to betray our marriage. I left her sitting in her expensive apartment, surrounded by furniture bought with stolen money and the wreckage of 20 years of marriage. The elevator ride down felt like descending from a great height, leaving behind a world of lies and landing back in reality. My phone was ringing as I reached the lobby, Patricia Chen, with an update that changed everything. The FBI just raided Sterling and Associates, she said. They seized computers, files, everything. Morrison's been transferred to federal custody. I stepped outside into the cool evening air, feeling the weight of inevitability settling over the situation. What about Marta? No word yet. But if they have Morrison's records, it's only a matter of time before they identify his accomplices. Which meant my 72-hour offer had just become meaningless. The federal investigation was moving faster than I'd anticipated, and Marta's window for making deals was closing rapidly. I should have felt satisfied. The woman who'd betrayed me was about to face the consequences of her choices, and I'd emerge from the wreckage with my reputation intact and my assets protected. Instead, I felt oddly empty, like a chess player who'd won a game that no longer seemed worth playing. My phone buzzed with a text from Marta. "Please come back. We need to talk." I deleted the message without responding and drove home to my quiet house, where broken windows had been replaced and the damage from Greg's rampage had been erased. Everything looked normal again, as if the morning's violence had been a bad dream. But normal was an illusion I could no longer maintain. Tomorrow, the federal investigation would expand to include my wife. The day after that, our divorce would become a matter of public record. By the end of the week, everyone would know that David Turner's marriage had collapsed in a spectacular mess of adultery and federal fraud charges. I poured myself a drink and settled into my reading chair with Patricia's report spread across the side table. The documents told a story of greed, betrayal, and the gradual corruption of people who'd convinced themselves that rules didn't apply to them. It was also the story of my revenge, though not in the way I'd originally planned. For months, I'd focused on exposing Marta's affair and destroying Greg's career. I'd succeeded beyond my wildest expectations, but the victory felt hollow. Revenge, I was learning, was like a controlled demolition. Sometimes you brought down more than you intended. My phone rang again. This time, it was Robert Walsh. "The FBI wants to interview you tomorrow morning," he said. "They're treating you as a witness, not a suspect, but you should have representation present." "What kind of questions?" "They'll want to know what you knew about your wife's activities when you first suspected irregularities, why you filed the ethics complaint against Morrison. And if I tell them the truth? Then you'll be helping them build a case against people who stole from the public trust. That's not a bad thing, David." Maybe not. But it felt like the final move in a game I was no longer sure I'd wanted to win. After Walsh hung up, I sat in my quiet house and thought about the choices that had brought me to this moment. Marta had chosen to betray our marriage. Greg had chosen to steal from municipal contracts. I had chosen to expose them both, knowing that the consequences would be severe. Now we all had to live with the results. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into its evening routine, porch lights coming on, garage doors opening as people returned from work, the comfortable rhythms of suburban life continuing despite the drama that had unfolded in my front yard. Tomorrow, those rhythms would be disrupted again when federal agents came to interview the man whose ethics complaint had triggered a major fraud investigation. The neighbors would whisper and speculate, and my quiet anonymity would be replaced by the kind of notoriety that followed people involved in federal crimes. But tonight, I was just a man sitting in his living room, reading documents that proved his wife was a criminal and his marriage was over. It wasn't the ending I'd planned, but it was the ending I'd earned. My phone buzzed one more time. Another text from Marta. "I signed the papers. I'm sorry for everything." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Some conversations were over, even when the other person was still talking. The next morning, I would meet with federal investigators and tell them everything I knew about Sterling and Associates' fraudulent billing practices. Marta would probably be arrested within days, joining Greg Morrison in federal custody while they both contemplated the consequences of their choices. And I would begin the process of rebuilding my life from the wreckage of our marriage, knowing that I'd won a victory that felt suspiciously like defeat. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, I had my quiet house, my reading chair, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes justice and revenge were the same thing, even when you weren't sure you wanted either one. The story ends here, with David Turner sitting in his living room, surrounded by the evidence of his successful campaign against the people who'd betrayed him. He'd gotten everything he'd wanted, his wife exposed as a criminal, her lover destroyed, their fraud scheme unraveled, but the victory felt hollow. Sometimes the last laugh isn't as satisfying as you thought it would be.